And apologies for the slight disruption. I think that was caused by us starting the recording, but I'll carry on from there. So you can see me and Kerry on the screen, who is our Trade Commissioner for Europe. You'll hear from both of us a bit first before we get into the depths of the webinar. Just a few housekeeping things from me before we get started. So we are going to plan to run through a series of presentations from our fantastic panel of speakers before we get to questions. So if you hold those for the end, we'll take all of them together. If I could just remind everyone to keep cameras off, mics muted while we're doing that so that everyone can focus on the speakers and presentations. And for questions, we're going to use the Q&A function, which hopefully you should all have in Teams. So if you're less familiar with the format, if you look along the little panel at the top of your screen, you will see one marked Q&A. Just tap on that, it'll open a panel, and you can put your questions into there, and we'll try and make sure that we get through all of the main ones. Other than that, just to note, we will also, when we get to the end of this, ask you for a bit of feedback. We'll just do that by a quick poll in a sidebar, which will only take you moments. It helps us get the most out of this and future presentations. So with that all said, I think that's probably enough housekeeping. Just a bit of context from me before we dive into things. So the reason I'm hosting this, as I said, is that I am the director of something called the Clean Power 2030 unit. Now, that's something we set up it's about a year and a bit old now. It was set up after the UK's last election, where a government came into power with a really clear mission that it wanted to achieve clean electricity across Great Britain by the year 2030. That's something that's quite sort of sharply defined for us, and it represents a big acceleration of a trend that's been going on anyway towards low carbon electricity. The way we're defining that is when we say clean power, what we mean is at least 95% of electricity generation across Great Britain coming from low carbon sources by 2030. So essentially everything other than unabated fossil fuel generation. The reason it's 95%, not 100%, is we're pragmatic about this. This is not a kind of evangelical crusade. It's a really practical thing. The reality is that by 2030, we will still need some fossil fuels, and essentially gas, on the system to keep everything running smoothly, but we'll gradually phase over time towards complete clean power. And that's part of a longer term journey. That's also the reason why when we talk about the ambition we have in the UK, and the government talks about its ambition for the UK to be a clean energy superpower, we have two parts of that. So we talk about clean power by 2030. We also talk about achieving and accelerating towards net zero by 2050. The one really builds on the other. So for us, reaching net zero, decarbonising the economy is a huge amount about electrification. So it's about electrifying the way we heat our homes, electrifying transport, and in many cases, the most efficient, cost-effective way to decarbonize industry is also going to be electrification. So what you need for that, you need low-carbon electricity so that when we electrify things, they are immediately low-carbon. And that's why we build this, and then that creates a foundation. It's also, in some ways, that idea of 2030, the easy part, because what we're expecting is as all of those things electrify, demand for electricity in the country will roughly double between 2030 and 2050. So that's an added challenge. It's a reason to start from a clean power base and build out from there. It's also a huge opportunity because we're going to need to continue to build out more infrastructure, more clean generation, more grid, lots of things that will give that speed of transition and will create opportunities. I will just give you a couple of stats on where wind fits into that picture, because that's what we're talking about today. The short version is wind will be the backbone of this. It will absolutely be the foundation of the clean power mix. So to give you a sense of that, we have around 15 gigawatts and 14 gigawatts respectively of offshore and onshore wind capacity on our system today. By 2030, so just 5 years away, we're expecting that offshore figure to increase to somewhere between 43 and 50 gigawatts, and onshore to rise to somewhere between 27 and 29. So huge increases. And that'll need to keep growing over the longer term as electricity demand doubles and as our system increases. So it's a massive challenge. It's also a huge opportunity. So I translate that into investment. We've had a running average of around £10 billion average into our power system over the last few years. To deliver that 2030 target and beyond that, we need to quadruple that to about £40 billion of investment every year from now to 2030, and then we'll keep just growing beyond that. that is extremely difficult. We talk about it as being at the edge of what's possible, but that's why it's a mission approach, and it is also absolutely feasible. The other way I look at this, because 2030 is really close in infrastructure terms, we can get right down to knowing exactly which projects are in scope. If it isn't in somebody's pipeline right now, it isn't going to be built to that time frame, most likely. So we can be really specific. We can understand that which projects these are, and we can also understand there are enough projects in the pipeline. This can be done, but it requires an awful lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of investment, and from our point of view, an awful lot of new jobs. So it's a fantastic, brilliant thing for the economy, and that is the perfect moment for me to turn, I think, to Kerry to talk about this from the wider trade and economic perspective.
Thank you very much, Ben. And you've got a much shinier background than I. I've jumped in a booth in the old Admiralty building as my last meeting overran, and it's quite a building to walk across. So apologies if you hear the small aircon in these booths, which I'm sure a number of you will be very familiar with. So I just wanted to jump on to say hello to everyone and give some broader perspective. In this role and my previous roles, I've had the benefit of travelling around Europe and internationally representing the UK, and I speak a lot to investors, regulators, politicians, etc., about our energy transition and the things that we're doing with the industrial strategy. And the constant ask is they ask me to share how we did what we did, what are we doing. They'd like to copy what we're doing in some cases, build on what we're doing, etc. And it's very clear, therefore, for me to see that the UK's position as quite a proactive leader in this global shift towards green industrial growth. We're often asked to lead thought groups with G7 nations and others about being opinion formers on our strategy around this and how we find the focus in the industrial strategy, which has really, the industrial strategy has really helped us build on this great platform we already have for renewables and put a renewed focus right through supply chain, local infrastructure, etc. And that kind of structural transformation, will have good long-term implications for competitiveness and resilience, as I see it. And that's an area where people are really starting to ask us now how we came to this conclusion and wanting to build on it. I was in the port of Antwerp, Brugge, only last week and others, and they're saying we really want to work with you on this. We want to be connected to the great work in the UK. There's a lot of leadership expected of us in the North Sea, other countries turning to us because of our stable regulatory environment to talk about what we're doing and push the transition. We do want to go even further, given that great position we're in, and act as a global supply chain hub for renewable energy technologies. There are strategic investments being made right across that supply chain that I was talking about, the infrastructure, but also the capability and skills and the innovation. And I'd note, this is about shaping the entire industrial base for us, not just individual projects. So it really is a whole government effort, working in partnership with industry and investment and others. And I think I'll add local authorities and the nations as well. We have quite a lot of regional strengths around our energy transition. So I'd encourage people to consider places like Teesside, Humber, Scotland and Wales, which are definitely becoming magnets for international investment. And I know firsthand that we have very enthusiastic local partners in those areas. And, I think that will, they are very aware from when I'm talking to them how much this contributes to their regional development goals. So they're very keen to work hand in glove with partners to deliver the energy transition. I personally feel quite passionate about it. Over 15 years ago, I worked on our first marine spatial plans for the UK. When we were looking at how we make space for major new offshore wind development, which just shows how much of a strategic platform we built in the UK from 15 years ago. But that, that's just the foundation. We're also interested in hearing how to maintain momentum through the next gen technologies, floating wind, grid integration, green hydrogen, etc. So you can see we're having a full kind of system approach and thought here, and would encourage stakeholders to think that way too, although I know many of you are. that integration of energy, industry and innovation, it really will benefit from international collaboration. And certainly because we're far ahead, we see it as an opportunity to then roll out favourable and for like networks elsewhere in Europe and the world. So it feels like we're in a good position to lead. I really would like to invite perspectives through this webinar and beyond on how we build those resilient and future-ready supply chains, and would note that us in government, investors, communities all have a role to play in that, and see it very much as a partnership approach. I'll close there just to say, hopefully from my enthusiasm, you've seen how much we are really committed to leadership in this energy transition and see it as a shared opportunity to accelerate decarbonisation and create high value jobs, as well as enhancing the energy security. So we're very ready to work with others to help shape that future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Fantastic to hear the energy, and also a great segue into the next part of our agenda, which is to hear from Archie, who's going to talk to us a bit about our industrial strategy and how wind and clean power investment fits into that.
And thanks very much, and thank you, Kerry, as well, for your really useful framing for this discussion. Great to see so many people on the call. My name's Archie McCrath. I work in the Industrial Strategy Unit in the Department for Business and Trade. Now, I'm not expecting everyone here to have read the industrial strategy and its 8 sector plans in their entirety. They're notoriously hundreds of pages, but I'm going to do my best to summarize in about 5 minutes what is a 10-year strategy, and one that, as Kerry said, really aims to crowd in investment into clean energy technologies and particularly wind supply chains. To kind of set the scene a bit, it's known that Britain has been suffering from slightly sluggish growth, flatlining productivity, and the lowest investment rates in the G7. I think it's for all of the last 5 years, and this is a strategy that really aims to turn that around. In terms of its areas of focus, it's really aimed at the critical need to boost that business investment. For too long, those levels have been too low. Secondly, there's a focus on what we've termed our growth driving sectors, as around sort of between 20 and 30% of our economy have contributed roughly, I think it's a bit over 60% of all productivity growth in the last 25 years. From these sectors, we want to shape what type of growth we're looking to achieve. We want to make sure that our growth is economically secure with resilient supply chains. We want to make sure we're delivering regional growth across the country, not just in London and the southeast. And crucially for this group, net zero is an incredible economic opportunity, and one we can't afford to let slip by. For all these sectors, we want to be making sure that we are reducing barriers to investment to make sure that we have the best environment for them possible for our businesses, so that we can make it simpler and also cheaper to scale and invest in the UK. Kerry alluded to it a second ago on implementation and partnership. This really is a whole of government endeavour on how we're going to achieve growth over the next 10 years. But it's been designed hand in hand with businesses through sector councils, through meticulous engagement and co-design, extensive consultation and support from our Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. But it's great to see so many of you here. It's so important that as we move to implementation, this is done in partnership. I mentioned our growth driving sectors. There are 8, which I won't go through them all, but crucially for this group, clean energy industries is really front and center of our industrial strategy. We produced a clean energy industries sector plan, which is all about driving and growing our capacity in clean manufacturing, innovation, and capabilities. for these sectors, of which wind is one of them, we're really committed to creating the best investment environment possible. There's a range of packages in the industrial strategy and the sector plan, from expanding access to finance, supporting skills and access to talent, and also reducing the cost of energy in the long term, which is delivering on some of the biggest asks we've had from businesses. The sector plan aims to double investment into our clean energy industries over the next 10 years, and particularly it focuses on growing exports in our clean energy industries, creating hundreds of thousands of good jobs, as Ben said, but also driving higher domestic commercialization of clean energy technologies. Kerry's right to point out that this is a long-term strategy, and innovation is hugely important for what is a very lively area. And finally, we really need to secure resilient and robust supply chains. We want to do this by providing greater long-term certainty to business and investors, putting forward catalytic public investment, notably through Great British Energy, and the recently announced Great British Energy's Clean Energy Industry Supply Chain Fund, breaking down notable barriers, as I mentioned, including energy prices, but challenges we have with infrastructure, and also skills support to ensure that we have the clean energy workforce that we need for the next 10 years. I'm going to pass over to colleagues in a second, Rubel and Susanna, who are going to talk through some of these policies in greater detail. But I think it's worth highlighting, there are some really chunky policies in this sector plan, notably that Great British Energy Supply Chain Fund, but also the increase in funding for the Clean Industry Bonus. This is also worth noting that this is really a 10-year strategy. It is not meant to be a sort of singular, although very long, published document. It should be living and an agile strategy that needs to be continuously worked on with people like yourselves, with businesses and investors, to make sure it is current and that we're focusing on the right areas. So we do really want to hear your perspectives and how we can really achieve growth for the UK, particularly when we're focusing on offshore wind, onshore wind, floating offshore wind supply chains. I will hand back to you, Ben, and then over to Susanna and Rubel.
Very much, Archie. Great stuff. And look, just to reassure everyone that this is working. We've seen around £50 billion of investment into clean energy over the last year or so. So this is a sector that is actually growing extremely fast, and this measures are starting to pay off. Right, as Archie said, I'm going to now dive more into first offshore and then onshore wind. So I'll invite Susanna and Rubel to take us through offshore.
Thanks very much, Ben and Archie. We've got a short presentation, so bear with us a moment as we share our screen with you.
There we go, that's working.
Okay, great. And hopefully Rubel is on the line as well. Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thanks, Rubel. So we're going to give you a bit more of a detailed overview of what's happening in the UK offshore wind policy space. So we'll give you a little bit of a lowdown on our latest statistics, followed by a deep dive into floating offshore wind policy, followed by a question, some more details on supply chain, going into financial incentives and government industry forums. We're really keen to flag this last point because, as you've heard from Ben, Archie and Kerry, this is very much a joint government business adventure, and we cannot achieve our goals without business. So I'll hand over to Rubel to run you through this slide.
Thank you very much, Susanna. So I'm just going to give a quick whistle-stop tour of the UK's offshore wind industry. So of course, offshore wind provides us with secure, domestically generated electricity, and it's representing a core part of our mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower. So the Clean Power Action Plan sets a capacity range for between 43 to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And of course, the UK is already a world leader in offshore wind with 16.1 gigawatts of generating electricity at the end of March 2025. So we have the highest deployment in Europe and are second in the world to China. Away from the fixed bottom, we are also a world leader in floating offshore wind with the second most installed capacity globally at 80 megawatts. And it's also estimated that the offshore wind sector could support up to 100,000 jobs by 2030. That gives you a quick overview of our offshore wind industry in the UK, and I'll hand back over to Susanna for the next slide.
Thanks, Rubel. So this is an illustration. This graph illustrates what the UK offshore wind pipeline looks like. The dark blue highlights the potential or the various phases in which fixed bottom offshore wind projects are at in the UK, and the light blue indicates where floating offshore wind is. So floating offshore wind projects account for about 30 gigawatts in the pipeline at the planning, pre-planning application and stages. You'll see that the fixed bottom offshore wind is the more mature market, but we do anticipate a high growth market in floating offshore wind, particularly post 2030. Back to Rubel.
Thank you very much. So we launched our Clean Power 2030 action plan, which set out a detailed plan for achieving the target of clean power by 2030. And the plan included a bold set of measures focused on delivering a once-in-a-generation upgrade to Britain's energy infrastructure. And at a very high level, it included reforming the grid's connection process to prioritize the most important projects, speeding up decisions on planning, and reforming our renewables auction, so the contracts for difference auction. Thank you. I'll hand back to Susanna.
Thanks, Rubel. So the contracts for difference is the UK government's primary mechanism for supporting new low-carbon electricity generation projects in the UK, in Great Britain, and it is funded through a levy on consumer bills. It guarantees a set price per megawatt of electricity for the duration of the contract, indexed to inflation. The CFD benefits include income stability, the guaranteed set price for electricity over 20 years. This is bankable. CFDs are a private law contract with a government-owned low-carbon contract company and are therefore low risk. So once you are awarded a CFD, the government does not intervene. This is a private law contract that is in place for 20 years. Given that CFDs are awarded through regular competitive auctions with the lowest price bid successful, they drive efficiencies and cost reduction, and this provides good value for money for the consumer. The two-way CFD design stabilizes income, making high upfront cost projects with long lifetimes and low running costs attractive to investors and lenders. It also protects consumers when electricity prices are high. Allocation Round 6 supported over 5 gigawatts of offshore wind at a clearing price of 82 megawatts per hour in 2024 prices and 194 megawatts per hour for floating offshore wind. We are constantly evaluating the contract for difference to ensure that it reflects the market that it's in and that we have this data within the contract for difference to reflect and deliver on our ambitions. So the government has announced a few policy reforms to this year's annual allocation round. We're relaxing the CFD eligibility criteria for fixed bottom offshore wind projects. So those projects that are in late planning stages can also enter the auction. We're also changing what information the Energy Secretary uses to inform the final budget for fixed bottom offshore wind, so that he can calculate more carefully the budget and ensure that the parameters set deliver on the ambition that we are hoping for from this round. And as you will have seen, we've extended the contract length from 15 to 20 years, building on those benefits that you saw in the first slide about bankability, low risk, and protecting consumers from a value for money perspective. The allocation round, allocation round 7, is currently open. The core parameters for these have already been published, with the administrative strike price for floating offshore wind being set to 271 megawatts per hour in 2024 prices and 113 for fixed bottom offshore wind. The government has strong ambitions for this round. As you heard from Ben at the start, we are gung-ho about our ambition to deliver clean power by 2030, and we expect AR7 to be the largest CFD round ever, supported by these reforms which will boost competition and secure better value for money for consumers. Now, I want to take you through floating offshore wind in the UK in a little bit more detail. The UK is a world leader in floating offshore wind, with the second most deployed capacity in the world at 80 megawatts, and the largest project pipeline based on seabed exclusivity at 30 gigawatts. Most of these projects are in northern Scotland, and we expect them to become online in the 2030s. So Scotland is home to the world's first floating offshore wind farm and the world's second largest floating offshore wind farm, Carnarvon. The ScotWind leasing round is a mixture of test and demonstration project availability with some larger scale projects in the pipeline too. Also recently secured in the last allocation round, Greenville, a floating offshore wind project off the coast of Scotland, became the largest floating offshore wind project in the world with a confirmed route to market. Specifically in the Celtic Sea, so in the UK we have two hotspots largely around Scotland and then in the Celtic Sea. We have 5 test and demonstration projects in development, totaling 430 megawatts of capacity. The Crown Estates leasing round 5 has also leased 3 gigawatts to date. There are plans for an additional 1.5 gigawatt project development area to be laid out in further detail later this month. On the whole, the Crown Estate has identified the potential for a further 12 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Celtic Sea, 4 to 10 gigawatts of which could be leased by 2030. So again, this is very much a high growth industry. Now, we can't talk about offshore wind without talking about ports. The UK is focused on building the domestic infrastructure and supply chain to support large-scale fixed and floating offshore wind. Ports play a vital role in the deployment, operation and maintenance of fixed and floating offshore wind farms by providing access to land and infrastructure, supporting manufacturing, assembly, integration, storage of turbines and components. There are several mechanisms that we have in the UK to support the build out of ports. So the National Wealth Fund has been established to mobilise private investment through a range of financial instruments, and at least £5.8 billion will be focused on 5 priority sectors, which includes ports. The UK government has also supported port development through a range of grant measures. So the Port of Cromarty Firth in Scotland was awarded £55 million in grant funding from the government to support the build out its build out for floating offshore wind, and a further up to £80 million has been identified for Port Talbot in Wales. We really recognise that if we cannot have these projects without the right infrastructure in place, and this goes back to Kerry's comments at the start that this industrial strategy is not just about one specific sector, but creating a whole ecosystem to ensure that investment benefits all of that, and we can deliver our ambitions in a multi-system approach. I'm going to pass you back to Rubel to discuss a little bit more about supply chains.
Thank you very much, Susanna. So the offshore wind market has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. Deployment ambitions both in the UK and beyond has increased global demand for offshore wind and exacerbated supply chain constraints. So this has created both challenges and opportunities. On the challenges, of course, constraints increase project costs and negatively impact on ambitions to accelerate deployment. Of course, in recent years, there's also been global events that have created uncertainty and volatility in the supply chain that has created a challenging commercial environment for offshore wind developers. Whilst on the other hand, it's also important to emphasize the significant opportunities that offshore wind deployment presents us with, particularly in capturing the economic benefits associated with deployment by expanding our industrial capabilities to meet both domestic and global demand. So key examples of UK successes in securing investment to expand our domestic industrial capabilities include SEIA, who are building a monopile factory in Teesside, as well as JDR and Sumitomo, who are both building cable factories. So we go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the Bringer report and the industrial growth plan, so the offshore wind sector's industrial growth plan published last year set out the priorities, objectives, actions, and investments that are needed in the key technologies identified in its make or buy analysis. So the plan set out the UK's opportunities to be a global technology leader in advanced turbine technology, industrialized foundations and substructures, electrical systems and cables, smart environmental services, and next generation installation and operations and maintenance. So government's activity is really focusing on capitalizing on the UK's strengths as set out in the offshore wind industrial growth plan. Of course, the plan itself was underpinned by supply chain capability analysis that had been undertaken previously. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So my colleague earlier spoke about the industrial strategy, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I am going to focus on the offshore wind opportunity and what was set out in the clean energy industries, if I can get my words out, apologies, sector plan for offshore wind. So in terms of the offshore wind opportunity, for each gigawatt of offshore wind installed, industry estimates that the sector contributes about £2 to £3 billion of gross value add to the UK, and the UK offshore wind sector exports were worth £2.4 billion in 2022. And as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, it's estimated that up to 100,000 jobs could be supported by the sector by 2030. And the clean energy industry sector plan sets out a clear action plan to drive investment certainty. And this includes via the capacity ranges I mentioned from the Clean Power Action Plan, the reforms to the CFD, and working with the Crown Estate to develop future leasing proposals. As mentioned by my colleague as well, providing catalytic public investment. So my colleague mentioned earlier the GB Supply Chain Fund. There's also the Clean Industry Bonus, which I'm going to come on to talk about. That was introduced as part of the this year's allocation round, so allocation round 7. And it also set out a plan about how we're going to break down barriers to investment, such as by addressing barriers to deployment and accelerating the planning process for offshore wind. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So the Clean Industry Bonus is designed to accelerate the development of cleaner and more sustainable offshore wind supply chains. And it does this by providing additional revenue support to developers who invest in the economic, social, and environmental sustainability of their supply chains. The Clean Industry Bonus will provide additional CFD revenue to applicants based on the fulfillment of 2 sustainability criteria, either investment in UK deprived areas or investment in cleaner supply chains. To go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of financial incentives, so Great British Energy is a new publicly owned energy company designed to drive energy deployment, create jobs, boost energy independence, and generate benefits for UK taxpayers, bill payers, and communities. And Great British Energy will invest in, develop, build, and operate the technology that the UK needs to increase our energy independence. And as my colleague mentioned in the industrial strategy, it was announced that there would be a £300 million supply chain fund supporting offshore wind. Next is the National Wealth Fund, which builds on the success of the former UK Infrastructure Bank. It has a broader mandate extending beyond infrastructure to support the delivery of the wider industrial strategy in areas where there is an undersupply of private finance, and at least £5.8 billion of the National Wealth Fund's budget is allocated to carbon capture, low carbon hydrogen, gigafactories, ports, which are key to offshore wind, of course, and green steel. And finally, of course, there's also funding programs being run by the Crown Estate to support the offshore wind supply chain. So I'll hand back to Susanna for the next slide.
Thanks, Rubal. So among our financial incentives to help support investment, we have free ports in UK export finance. So UK free ports are designated areas within the UK where different economic regulations apply, aiming to boost economies through investment, job creation, and innovation. They offer tax reliefs, simplified custom procedures, and streamlined planning process to attract businesses and encourage regeneration. These zones are designed to foster global trade and investment, particularly in sectors like renewable energy. UK Export Finance has a range of products to help support UK businesses and businesses that then choose to invest in the UK export internationally. Particularly, the Export Development Guarantee helps companies who export from or plan to export from the UK access high-value loan facilities for general working capital or capital expenditure purposes. UKEF can provide partial guarantees covering up to 80% of the risk to lenders for a maximum repayment period of up to 5 years or up to 10 years if the loan is to develop clean growth exports such as renewable energy. This means that if you are a manufacturer looking to invest in a UK facility, you can access UKEF's export development guarantee from the moment that from the onset. So this is something that can be at the start and part of that broader package of support when you're scoping the UK market. Now, as I said at the start of the presentation, all our ambitions cannot be delivered without industry. And there are a range of government and industry forums in the UK where we discuss strategies for offshore wind and ensure that everyone has a voice and we can work together to deliver this common strategy. We have the Offshore Wind Industry Council. This is a senior government and industry forum established to drive the development of the UK's offshore wind industry. The Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, chairs this, and this is supported by his Vice Chair, Michael Shanks. There is also a delivery body for the Industrial Growth Plan. This is the plan that Rubel explained earlier on in the presentation, which identified UK comparative advantages across the offshore wind supply chain and laid out strategies for capturing these and the economic value across the life cycle of an offshore wind farm. We also have the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership. This is a business transformation program that promotes closer collaboration across the supply chain and has a very strong representation of SMEs. We have the Strategic Investment Model. This is a collaborative framework between ScotWind developers, Crown Estate Scotland and Scottish Government to understand and agree how to collaborate and deliver supply chain growth in Scotland. And this is all about aggregating demand to help facilitate more strategic decisions when investing. And finally, last but not least, the Offshore Wind Renewable Energy Catapult. This is an innovation and research centre supported by the commercialisation of floating offshore wind. It's also funded by UK government to carry out knowledge sharing activities with partner countries. Thank you very much for listening. As you can see, there is a whole range of incentives going on in the offshore wind space, and we're very happy to take any questions that you may have at the end of the session. And I'm going to hand you back to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both. That's great. Loads of content in there. I am really conscious we are quite a bit behind time, so I'm going to ask our next two speakers to keep it to 5 minutes each, please, so we can make sure there's time for questions at the end. That is the danger of having a lot of content. Joe, over to you for onshore wind in 5 minutes.
Oh, blimey, okay. Hi folks, very grateful to be here today. My name's Joe. I lead in our department on the technical and supply chains brief for onshore wind. I've been here for about 5 years. When I joined 5 years ago, there was 3 of us working on onshore wind, solar and hydropower, and onshore wind was 0.5 of my time and no one else's, and now we have a team of 10 full-time civil servants beavering away on all things onshore wind. So it gives you an idea of the growth that we've experienced. I'll talk a little bit about the current policy context and the priorities that we've got over the next 12 months or so. So 15 months ago, you'll be aware that we removed the de facto planning ban on onshore wind in England. But we realised that this wasn't enough. You know, firstly, it takes 4 to 9 years for an onshore wind farm to go from inception through to operation. And there was questions about how much additional deployment we could get in England between now and 2030. And secondly, of course, over the last decade, quite a lot of policy areas would have grown up and matured without due consideration to onshore wind. And there may be other barriers to development that developers would face. To address this, we set up the Onshore Wind Industry Task Force, which kind of had the exam question of how do you close that gap to 2030, streamline and fast-track new projects, as well as kind of de-risk the existing pipeline, but also had other objectives of how do we manage the impacts of onshore wind when it does deploy on other land or airspace users and make sure that development is sustainable, and also how do we capture the benefits of accelerated onshore wind deployment, both locally in the area hosting the site, but also more broadly at a national level through investment in kind of facilities in the supply chain, securing jobs and growth. Which is about a 12-month project, this task force. There was an executive committee who kind of received advice and recommendations from 6 expert working groups in a kind of iterative process. And the output of that was our onshore wind strategy, which was published in July this year, which I encourage you to go and read. And essentially that strategy set out, according with the clean power deployment ranges for onshore wind, we need about 27 to 29 gigawatts of onshore wind in Great Britain from 15 gigawatts today. What do we need to do to achieve that, to close that gap, to accelerate deployment, to manage the impacts of deployment, but also capture the benefits? And the strategy set out 42 actions across kind of 6 key intervention areas. The Onshore Wind Task Force has now transitioned into a delivery body. We've done the talking. It's now time to go ahead and build the stuff. And it's now an Onshore Wind Council, which is overseeing the delivery of these actions. And we've got a number of priority areas that we're focusing on. One of which is around kind of planning, skills, training and resource. Without large onshore wind coming through, particularly in England, for a decade, we need to make sure that the people who are making the decisions on this infrastructure are well equipped to do so. We're looking at kind of new policy and guidance to support repowering. And we're also looking at reforming permitted development rights as well to support kind of small and medium-sized onshore wind under certain circumstances. We are working with the Ministry of Defence to conduct a series of flight trials at some of their RAF bases to test new technologies that might support the mitigation of onshore wind turbine interference on radar systems. In doing so, we think we can tackle around kind of 2 to 3 gigawatts of the future onshore wind pipeline. And we're also working to bring forward, in a similar vein, new policy and updated approach to the management of onshore wind turbine interference with seismic array systems, tackling a particular instance in southern Scotland, where we think there's around about 3 gigawatts of onshore wind that could be released prior to 2030. And we're also doing quite a lot of work with the civil aviation sector as well to bring down costs, increase transparency, and we think around 10 gigawatts of the future onshore wind pipeline could be affected by that. Lastly, on the supply chain side in particular, we're working with our colleagues in the Contracts for Difference scheme to consider not whether the clean industry bonus could be expanded to include onshore wind, but I think more accurately to consider what changes would need to be made to the clean industry bonus scheme so that it could support the successful delivery of greater investment in onshore wind, noting that there's quite a lot of peculiarities about the onshore wind sector, which means that some of the ways the scheme are currently set up might not work. So we're looking into that. And we're also working closely with Renewable UK, who are the main trade body for onshore wind in the UK, to commission a supply chain capability analysis akin to the one that was done for offshore wind several years ago, which hopefully gives us the evidence and the data that we need to take a more kind of mature approach to investment in the sector from a supply chains perspective. That will do for now, but I look forward to taking questions at the end if you have any.
Thanks, Joe. Impressive speed. On which I hope what we're giving you all is a sense of just the real sort of urgency, pace and focus that we're applying to all of this from UK government. We're absolutely determined to get this to move very, very quickly. On which note, last but not least, Paul, you're here talking from the perspective of the National Energy System Operator, which has also celebrated its first birthday relatively recently. Over to you.
I am. Thank you very much, Ben. I have some slides to share, but I'm not able to click the share button at the moment. If somebody could release that permission, it would be much appreciated. So good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be with you today. I'm Paul Wakely from the National Energy System Operator. As Ben says, we have just celebrated our first birthday as an independent public corporation within GB. And it also marks just over the 1-year anniversary of us no longer using any coal for the generation of electricity in Great Britain. I went back to get the yearly statistic just before the presentation and noted coal wasn't there. It came off on the 30th of September a year ago. We've made huge strides in GB to decarbonise our energy system. Now around only 30% of our electricity is generated from fossil fuels, and that being gas, the vast majority now coming from renewables, particularly wind onshore and offshore, and other low carbon technologies. So I'd move to the next slide, please. That'd be much appreciated. NESO sits at the heart of the energy sector. We were set up, as I say, just over a year ago under the Energy Act as an independent public corporation, as the independent system operator and planner. So we are the system operator we are the planner of the entire energy system, both gas and electricity, and now in future hydrogen. And we also operate the electricity system in real time. And it's our role to ensure that we are making and having the energy system as a whole sitting at the centre that contributes towards decarbonisation, affordability, and a secure system where ultimately the lights stay on. My particular role is around planning and how we make sure that those lovely low carbon megawatts that are generated from onshore wind, offshore wind and other technologies can get from where they're generated to where they are needed to drive forward our economic growth and decarbonisation. Next slide, please. So we, as both NESO and previously as the National Electricity System Operator, have been planning and thinking ahead for our electricity network for some time, and already have ambitious plans in place, around £120 billion worth of investment in the networks out to 2035 to connect up a large amount of renewable generation across the length and breadth of Great Britain, including around more than 50 gigawatts of offshore wind into the middle part of the next decade. So we published a number of plans that are out there, and you may have seen. So taking the current network, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, and evolving that through to the network that's needed for 2030. And this is the same network that will get us and deliver us clean power. So you'll see that proliferation of links down the east coast connecting offshore wind and other sources of generation. That's designed to support clean power, and then that network then for 2035 connecting even more offshore wind, designed around the 6th carbon budget, connecting onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, batteries, other duration technologies, storage technologies as well. So a significant investment there. Obviously strategic planning doesn't stop. We're always on to the next cycle and what's coming next. If we could just have the last slide, please, that would be much appreciated. So we as NESO are currently undertaking a piece of work called the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. We run out of 3-letter acronyms, so move to 4-letter acronyms. This is the SSEP. This will, for the first time, look at where the big blocks of our energy system should go in the future. So where the next deployments of offshore wind, onshore wind, solar and storage will go across the country. That will then feed into the longer term network needs. So what does that strategic network need to do to develop? We also have a role in the regional energy planning, working with local parts of the country, the regions and the nations, to understand particularly the lower scale, so particularly the smaller, maybe community onshore wind, where that fits into the pattern and how they see that working. So it's a really exciting time to be at NESO, at the heart of the energy industry, bringing together all of those different pieces that ultimately will enable and drive forward the decarbonisation, sustainable, secure future for Great Britain. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you, and thank you for the speed. That was great, considering there's an awful lot of stuff there. Right, that brings us to the end of our presentations, everyone. So we've still got all of our speakers with us, and we've got around 10 minutes or so. So as I said earlier, please do put questions into the Q&A panel. Alternatively, the meeting chat is fine, or if you'd prefer, we can do this the old-fashioned way and do just raise a hand, and I'll bring you in to ask any questions. To answer the obvious one that's been raised in the chat, absolutely, we will share the slides afterwards, including for anyone who couldn't see them, for which apologies. While you're all thinking, Jean-Christophe did raise a question earlier, and this might be one for you, Paul, which is just setting the OFTO process in the context of the grid connection reform, which is obviously a somewhat different thing, but maybe you could relate the two to each other.
Was that for me, Ben? Sorry.
That was for you.
Technology issues today. I think I heard, where does OFTO fit in the process?
The question, let me read the question.
Sorry.
So this was Jean-Christophe, and the question was, you mentioned an upcoming reform of the grid connection process. Will this impact the OFTO process?
Okay, great question. So what we're currently doing is reforming the grid connection process. So broadly speaking, there's 6, 7, 800 gigawatts of stuff in the connection process that wants to get connected. That's not all going to be needed. So this process is designed to refine that down to those that are ready, needed, and strategically aligned. So that is around the grid connection process. The OFTO process is slightly different. The OFTO process is the process by who owns the wire that connects the offshore wind farm back to shore. So it's not directly related to the connections process, but I do see some interaction. If you have a specific question, I'm very happy to pick it up. I can drop you my email address and we can do that. They should be fully compatible, is my understanding.
Thanks so much. I think the next question, and actually the one after it are related, but let's take the one from Ian, who's asked, and I love this. He talks about his company manufactures fixed and floating heavy lift launch and recovery solutions, and wants to know if they're considering adding manufacturing in the UK, how can GB Energy and the Clean Investment Bonus, or indeed our other initiatives, I imagine, support with that, which I love that one. Susanna Ribble, I suspect this is one you might be able to help with.
Thanks, Ben. So the GB Energy have launched a £300 million. Well, they haven't launched. They are going to launch a £300 million fund to support investment into the UK supply chain, with details due at the end of this year. So I guess the simple answer is watch this space. We do have a few more announcements coming up, and as soon as we get more details on the GB Energy Fund and how the scheme criteria, including and whether you're eligible to apply, we will issue that through our international network, and your usual contacts at DBT will be able to support you through that process. The Clean Industry Bonus is very much something that is part of the contract for difference, and so the purpose of the Clean Industry Bonus, as you saw earlier in our presentation, is to help developers make more sustainable supply chain choices. So this supports supply chain investors in the sense that we want to support the growth of sustainable supply chain, and we are prepared to do that by providing some extra funding that matches our criteria. So different schemes apply to different entry points, and depending where you are in terms of your investor journey, we can point you in the right direction and which schemes are most relevant to you. So I believe we will be sharing details at the end of the presentation, or at the end of this session, but very happy to have a follow-up discussion if useful.
That's brilliant. The next question is very much in a similar vein, but maybe just broadening it out a bit. So Axel's asked if there are any incentives to attract foreign investment and development into the wind and clean energy sectors. So I think, Susanna, partly for you, but DBT colleagues in general, do you want to sort of set out the landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are very excited by the market potential of offshore wind, and there are several levers at our disposal to encourage that investment, and really even this webinar is part of our message today to kind of sell that opportunity and make the case as to why we think the UK is the best place to invest. The UK is the largest offshore wind market in Europe, as you've seen. We have huge potential for offshore wind. Notably, the UK is also interested in building out supply chain where we can be cost competitive. So those of you who have been following the offshore wind landscape in the UK closely will know that we had a failed allocation round 5, where we did not secure any offshore wind bids. Now, there were several reasons why that auction was a failure, but I think more importantly for this discussion, one of the key takeaways from that auction failure was that the UK government needed to think about sustainable pricing. We're very mindful about the ecosystem of investment, and we need to ensure that the pricing that we set is balanced between value for money for consumers, but ensuring that also the pricing available is economically viable for investors. And this is why we kind of test results every year to ensure that our market intel is accurate when setting those pricing parameters. So I think another key message that I would like you all to take away today is this is very much us getting started. You've heard repeatedly that we are really gung-ho about our ambition to accelerate offshore wind and ensure that that market opportunity becomes a reality. So that is our main message to you today, and hopefully one that is landing.
Thanks so much, Susanna. That's all of the questions I have at the moment. There's still a couple of minutes left, so while you're thinking about whether you've got any final questions, I'll just reminds us at the start, we are going to just put a brief survey in the sidebar. It'll only be a couple of questions, but just to see how you found this, give us any feedback, and that will really help us with making sure we target future events in the right way. Okay. Now, my rambling hasn't prompted any further questions from anyone, so I'm very happy to leave it there unless there are any more going once. All right. Thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you to all of our speakers as well. And we will share the materials and slides from this presentation with you all afterwards. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.